In the heart of West Africa lies a nation that has endured years of unrest, fear, and uncertainty. Once a symbol of hope and revolution, Burkina Faso found itself spiraling into chaos. The threat of terrorism crept closer with each passing day. Political leadership seemed disconnected from the people's pain, and faith in democracy began to erode. As the streets filled with anger, desperation, and protest, one young man was quietly preparing to do the unthinkable. Ibrahim Traoré was not a name known to many outside military circles. A soft-spoken, highly disciplined soldier from the small town of Bondokui, he wasn't seen as a threat to power, until he rose up and seized it. At just 34 years old, he led a stunning coup that toppled the government and declared himself the new head of state. In an instant, the youngest president in Africa had been born. To some, he was a savior, bold, unshaken, and ready to defend his people from the forces tearing the country apart. To others, he was a warning, another soldier with promises of peace and justice, stepping into power without a vote. But no matter where you stand, his rise sent shockwaves across the continent and far beyond. This is the story of how a young captain from a forgotten corner of Burkina Faso shocked the world, challenged global powers, and gave new voice to a generation of Africans demanding change. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who may be reshaping history. Long before the world knew his name, before the uniforms, the weapons, and the power, Ibrahim Traoré was just a boy growing up in the quiet rural village of Bondokui in western Burkina Faso. Life there wasn't easy. It was a place where kids learned to survive before they learned to dream. But even then, Ibrahim stood out, not for being loud or rebellious, but for being curious, thoughtful, focused. He wasn't born into privilege. His family lived modestly, like most in the region. Yet, what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in values. Discipline, integrity, and a fierce belief in community were etched into his upbringing. Ibrahim grew up watching his people work hard for so little. Farmers under the scorching sun, mothers walking miles just to fetch clean water. That image never left him. Education became his first act of rebellion against circumstance. He pursued his studies with quiet intensity, eventually earning a place at the University of Ouagadougou, where he studied geology, a path that could have led him deep into the earth, far away from power. But the winds of destiny had other plans. Surrounded by political tension and growing insecurity, Ibrahim felt a deeper calling, one not written in books, but in action. He joined the Burkinabe army, not for fame, but for purpose, and though he spoke little, his presence was undeniable. Fellow soldiers described him as a man of few words but powerful actions. He wasn't the kind of leader who shouted commands from the front. He earned respect by moving with calm precision, always listening, always watching. He climbed the ranks not because of connections, but because of competence. Yet, military life came with its trials. The army was underfunded, morale was low, and Burkina Faso's fight against jihadist insurgency was costing lives. Ibrahim saw things most would never forget. Decisions were being made far from the battlefield by leaders who didn't bleed with the soldiers or cry with the families left behind. Slowly, a fire began to burn within him, and then, one day, something happened. Something that would push him to his limit. Something that made him realize leadership wasn't a dream. It was a necessity. By the time Ibrahim Traoré had earned his stripes in the military, Burkina Faso was no longer just struggling, it was bleeding. The once promising West African nation had become the epicenter of a deepening security and political nightmare. Towns were falling like dominoes to insurgent groups. Schools were closing. Roads became death traps patrolled by terrorists. The northern and eastern regions of the country, once filled with farmers and traders, were now ghost towns. Jihadist insurgency, linked to groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, had carved through communities with brutal precision. Villages were burned, children orphaned, civilians caught between bullets and silence. Over 2 million people were displaced, and thousands had died. For many, hope wasn't just fading, it was gone. But this crisis didn't erupt overnight. It was the result of years of weak governance, broken promises, and systemic neglect. The previous governments, especially under President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, were accused of being out of touch, slow to act, and too reliant on foreign military support, particularly from France, the former colonial power. People started asking hard questions. Why can't we defend ourselves? Why are we still depending on outsiders? Why are our leaders so silent while we suffer? The economy was in freefall, weighed down by inflation, corruption, and the cost of war. Bread, fuel, and basic necessities became luxuries in many homes. Jobs were scarce, schools were closing, hospitals lacked supplies. And still, government officials lived comfortably behind armored cars and guarded gates. Inside the military, morale was collapsing. Soldiers were sent to the front lines with little support and outdated weapons. Many felt they were being used as pawns by politicians who had no clue what it meant to risk their lives. The rift between the front lines and the presidency grew wider by the day. Frustration turned into whispers. Whispers turned into fury. And then came the mutinies. Quiet at first, but impossible to ignore. In January 2022, Kabore was ousted in a coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who promised security and reform. But months passed, and little changed. The insurgency spread. The people waited, and the military, again, watched their leaders fail. The disillusionment was complete. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was survival. People didn't care who was in charge, as long as someone could protect their homes, bring back their children, and give them their country back. And within this crumbling system, a young captain named Ibrahim Traoré was, watching it all, listening, thinking, waiting. The people were angry. The soldiers were ready. The nation was on the edge. And Traoré? He was about to jump into history with both feet. September 30th, 2022, a date that will forever echo through the corridors of Burkina Faso's history. In a stunning turn of events, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a 34-year-old officer barely known beyond military ranks, did the unimaginable. He led a swift, precise, and bloodless coup that toppled the very man who had promised change just months earlier, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. It wasn't just unexpected, it was surgical. While the world was still watching Burkina Faso struggle under jihadist attacks, rising poverty, and political stagnation, Traoré was moving with quiet intent. Whispers among the ranks had turned into organized resolve. Damiba's regime, already weakened by continued insecurity and rising public distrust, was living on borrowed time. And Traoré? He had the support of the frustrated, the soldiers who had seen enough, and the people who had lost everything. The coup itself was a masterclass in coordination. Gunfire rang out in the capital, Ouagadougou, as soldiers blocked key roads, took over state media, and surrounded government buildings. There were no long speeches, no violent chaos, just a clear message delivered to the nation. Damiba is out. Traoré is in. By the time Damiba tried to negotiate his return, it was too late. Traoré's forces not only outmaneuvered the top generals, but also captured the hearts of a nation desperate for new leadership. And then, in his first address to the public, standing in military gear but speaking like a man with a mission, Traoré said the words that hit deep. The situation calls for humility, sacrifice, and total commitment. We are not here for power. We are here to save our people. The reaction? Electric. In the streets, thousands erupted in celebration. Young people waved Burkinabe flags and painted murals of Traoré's face with slogans like "Our Captain" and "Hope has a name." To them, he was not just another soldier. He was their soldier, the one who didn't sit behind a desk, but had marched through the dust with them, the one who had finally stood up when no one else would. The international community, however, was stunned and skeptical. Statements flooded in from the United Nations, the African Union, France, and ECOWAS. Words like destabilizing, unconstitutional, and troubling filled the airwaves. But in Ouagadougou, the only words that mattered were from the people in the streets. Let him lead. At just 34, with no formal political experience, no flashy campaign, and no foreign backing, Ibrahim Traoré had seized control of a nation, and with it inherited its pain, its problems, and its people's dreams. But as celebrations faded and adrenaline cooled, one question loomed over everyone's mind. Could he actually deliver? As the new leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré didn't waste time with half measures. The weight of his promise was crystal clear from his first few public addresses. Security, the very foundation of his legitimacy, was his primary focus. In a country crippled by jihadist insurgencies and on the brink of collapse, Traoré vowed to reclaim national pride and restore order. But how would this relatively unknown 34-year-old with little international experience pull off such a colossal task? In a series of bold, decisive moves, Traoré began dismantling the existing order, all while declaring a deep commitment to national sovereignty. His message was simple but direct. No more dependence on foreign powers. No more hollow promises from corrupt leaders. This is Burkina Faso's time. One of his first major policy shifts? Traoré made it clear that the French military presence, which had been a fixture in Burkina Faso and other Sahelian countries for years, was no longer welcome. The anti-French sentiment had been simmering in Burkina Faso for years, fueled by resentment over French colonial history and dissatisfaction with the inability of France's Operation Barkhane forces to secure the region. The people of Burkina Faso had been asking, why are we still relying on foreign soldiers while our country falls apart? Traoré made a powerful statement by expelling French troops, a move that shocked both Paris and the international community. It wasn't just a rejection of foreign military presence. It was a bold assertion of sovereignty. He made it clear that Burkina Faso would no longer be a pawn in a foreign game. It was a risky move that put him at odds with one of the world's most powerful countries, but it resonated deeply with the Burkinabe people, many of whom felt abandoned by their former colonizers. And it wasn't just about France. Traoré's administration started questioning the role of Western influence in Africa as a whole. The presence of international organizations and foreign governments had been a constant, but Traoré seemed determined to pivot towards Pan-African unity, making it clear that Burkina Faso would follow its own path, one not defined by the whims of the West. His Pan-African stance was not just a political slogan. It became a symbol of defiance, an embrace of African unity and self-determination. Traoré was determined to break free from the shackles of Western control and to lead Burkina Faso into an era where it stood proud and independent. His rhetoric echoed the calls of leaders like Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary figure who had inspired a generation, but whose legacy had been drowned by years of instability. Traoré's rhetoric was infused with a vision of African empowerment, and he openly admired leaders who dared to chart their own course, from Kwame Nkrumah to Patrice Lumumba. His government began reaching out to fellow African nations, calling for a united Africa, free from the influences of former colonial powers and Western dominance. For many in Burkina Faso, it was the rebirth of a national identity. For others, It was a necessary rejection of a system that had failed them. But for the international community, it was a bold gamble. In his most public moments, Traoré's speeches were filled with passion. He promised to restore security, to protect the sovereignty of the nation, and to give his people a sense of dignity and power that had been long lost. But beneath these promises lay the reality that, despite the growing popularity among his people, Traoré faced an overwhelming challenge. By the end of 2022, Ibrahim Traoré had already become something much bigger than just a leader in Burkina Faso. In a time of growing frustration with Western influence, neo-colonialism, and corrupt leadership, Traoré's rise to power became a beacon for Pan-Africanism. His bold rejection of France and the West struck a chord not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa, particularly among the youth, a generation hungry for change and tired of the status quo. In every speech, in every act of defiance, Traoré became a symbol of what could be, a new kind of leadership, one that wasn't bound by the chains of history or beholden to foreign powers. His message was clear. Africa had the potential to stand tall on its own. The youth of Africa, who had often felt ignored, exploited, or marginalized by both Western nations and their own governments, now saw in Ibrahim Traoré a leader who understood their pain and was willing to do something about it. Social media exploded with support for Traoré, especially across French-speaking West Africa. His Pan-African rhetoric made him an icon of resistance against colonial legacies and the lingering influence of former colonial powers. His rejection of foreign military presence wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was a call to arms for Africa's self-determination, a rallying cry for young Africans who were tired of seeing their countries caught in the grip of foreign intervention and exploitation. But Traoré didn't just stop at speeches. His influence grew rapidly, catching the attention of other military-led governments in West Africa, many of which were also grappling with instability, insurgency, and frustration over foreign interference. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, nations that had also seen military coups in recent years, looked to Traoré as a model. These countries, led by military juntas, shared common struggles with Burkina Faso, and, like Traoré, their leaders had come to power promising change and rejecting the West in favor of a more self-sufficient and sovereign path for their nations. In Mali, the junta leader Colonel Assimi Goïta and his government had already distanced themselves from France, announcing the withdrawal of French forces in 2022. The military-led government in Niger, under General Abdourahmane Tiani, echoed similar sentiments, expressing admiration for Traoré's leadership style and vision for Africa's future. The growing regional solidarity among these military governments was not only a challenge to Western powers, but also an indication of a wider shift in West Africa, where young, charismatic military leaders were emerging as symbols of the fight against perceived foreign domination. What made this moment even more striking was how young Africans, especially the youth, began to view Traoré. They saw in him not just a military leader, but a visionary. In many ways, he became the personification of what young, Pan-African dreams could look like. An Africa where nations were no longer beholden to foreign interests, where the youth had a voice, and where leaders understood their struggles. Traoré's influence spread like wildfire, not just because of his actions, but because he represented a promise of change that seemed within reach. His defiance of Western military presence, his embrace of sovereignty, and his focus on security and independence resonated deeply with the growing sense of Pan-African identity. Yet, with all the admiration, one question lingered. While Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power was celebrated as a triumph of sovereignty and self-determination, it didn't take long for the criticisms to surface. What many saw as a necessary rejection of foreign powers and a reassertion of national pride. Others began to label as the early signs of an emerging dictatorship. From the very beginning of his rule, there were accusations that Traoré had overstepped the boundaries of his role. The military junta under his leadership began to act with increasing authoritarianism, suppressing dissent and restricting freedoms. The media, long considered a critical voice in Burkina Faso, found itself increasingly censored. Independent journalists were detained, and critical news outlets were either silenced or forced to toe the government line. It didn't take long for Burkinabe citizens and international observers alike to start wondering, is Traoré becoming what he once fought against? For many of the younger generation who had placed their hopes in his ability to steer Burkina Faso toward a more democratic and free society, the realization was jarring. The same freedom that Traoré had promised to protect seemed to be slipping away. Opposition parties that once enjoyed relative freedom were now finding their voices stifled. Traoré's government also began to face serious allegations of human rights abuses. Security forces, in their pursuit of jihadists and insurgents, were accused of carrying out extrajudicial killings and disappearances. What started as a noble attempt to secure the country soon became clouded by concerns over brutality and the erosion of civil liberties. Critics, both domestic and international, were quick to draw comparisons to the very military regimes that had previously plunged Burkina Faso into instability. As the situation deteriorated, the line between security and freedom became increasingly blurred. Traoré, who had been hailed as a defender of sovereignty, now found himself trapped in a delicate balancing act, maintaining order and fighting insurgents while avoiding the very authoritarianism that had cost the country so much in the past. It was a question that weighed heavily on his leadership. Could he restore peace without compromising the very freedoms his people craved? While Traoré's supporters argued that the threat of terrorism and the state of emergency justified his measures, many others began to question whether sacrificing freedom for security was the right choice. Was he still fighting for the ideals of justice, liberty, and sovereignty, or was he becoming a puppet of power, blinded by his own control? The rise of censorship was perhaps the most tangible sign of this shift. Where once the media was free to criticize, now it was forced to fall in line, leaving many to wonder, was this the same Traoré who had promised to give the people their voice? As media outlets were shut down or forced into silence, many began to fear that the dream of a free Burkina Faso was slipping out of reach. Critics were also quick to highlight Traoré's increasing military presence in every aspect of national life. Military parades and state-sponsored displays of force became more common, and it was clear that the military junta was tightening its grip on the country. Civil society organizations, once a vital part of Burkina Faso's political discourse, found themselves under pressure, and many feared the worst, that the country was sliding into another era of authoritarian rule. For all his successes, Ibrahim Traoré now stood at a crossroads. Could he stay true to the promises that brought him to power? Or was he on the verge of becoming just another military leader who sacrificed liberty for security? In a country that had already endured so much turmoil, the fine line between order and oppression was growing thinner by the day. Ibrahim Traoré's journey is more than just a story of a man who came to power. It is about reshaping the narrative of what African leadership can be. His Pan-African rhetoric and rejection of Western dominance have positioned him as a symbol of hope for many across the continent, especially for those who have long felt marginalized by the global political system. He represents the dream of a future where African nations stand independent, unified, and sovereign, free from foreign interference and exploitation. Yet, the road ahead is fraught with challenges. Burkina Faso is a nation caught in the throes of a violent insurgency, and despite Traoré's efforts, the security situation remains dire. His military-based leadership is still in its early stages, and while his promises to restore peace and pride are compelling, the reality of governance may present obstacles that even his best intentions cannot overcome. The key question now is, can Traoré deliver on his promises? Will his leadership inspire long-term stability, or will he fall into the same trap that has ensnared so many of his predecessors? Power, corrupting the very ideals he once stood for. Traoré's leadership has already begun to have a ripple effect across West Africa. His anti-Western stance and assertion of African sovereignty are themes that resonate deeply with military-led governments in Mali, Niger, and Guinea. As more nations look to him as a model, the impact of his leadership could have significant implications for the future of African governance. Will this trend lead to a new wave of African-led independence, or will it unravel into a series of military juntas unable to deliver on the promises of freedom and prosperity? Perhaps the most crucial question is how history will remember Ibrahim Traoré. Will he be hailed as a visionary leader who changed the trajectory of Burkina Faso and Africa? Or will he be remembered as just another military leader whose dreams of liberation gave way to the darkness of authoritarian rule?